Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our first space settlement seminar of the year. This is our first webinar format. So we have done the space settlement seminars at Blue Marble Space for the last couple of years. They've been pretty much internal to our community. And this is the first year that we have, broadened our participation to anybody who's interested, people on our mailing list, people who might be watching the live stream on YouTube. And then this will be viewable then, of course, after the event. So for those of you who don't know, Blue Marble Space, we're a nonprofit organization focused on astrobiology, space exploration, and empowering the next generation of scientists. And within Blue Marble Space, we have an ongoing effort to think about space settlement, which includes the idea of humans migrating beyond Earth to live in space environments, whether that's low Earth orbit, on the moon, on Mars, and even beyond. There's certainly a lot of activity within the private sector and national governments in developing the technology necessary to live in space, and that's of course a critical part of the story. But we focus a lot on the human dimensions of space settlement. So the ethics, the philosophy, the legal implications, the social dimensions, things like planetary protection, and just thinking about the future in general, drawing upon future studies and other methodologies from the humanities and social sciences that allow us to think about where we might be going as a species and as a civilization. And so today for the webinar, it's myself, I'm Jacob Haqq-Misra. We have Graham Lau here, and we're going to just have a little conversation. I'll give a presentation from some of the work that I've done on space settlement, followed by a presentation by Graham, and then we will have a conversation, and all of you can have a chance to type your questions in the chat and contribute to this. So hopefully this will be fun, and also kind of kick off this webinar series for other episodes later this year. So with that, I am going to share my screen here and just go through. I think this will be maybe about 20 minutes or so. I always probably go longer than I want to, but I'll try not to make it too long. But I was very excited to put this together. So how will space settlement shape our future? And I'll say just up front, when we say space settlement, space colonization is a synonym. There's maybe reasons that we prefer the term space settlement, but I mean, it's really the same idea, just humans moving from Earth to live on other planets, long duration inhabitants of another planet. And so, I'll start by just saying, space settlement and thinking about space and space exploration has already changed us. It's already transformed us. So hopefully you have seen this. This is the view of the sky. And, we have the moon, Venus, and Mars. And for most of human history, Mars was not a place that you thought about going. It was a long time before we even thought about Mars as a planet that had anything like Earth. Ancients realized that Mars and Venus moved differently than the stars. But it wasn't until, just very recently, the last, couple centuries, that we even thought about Mars as a physical place, and especially one that you might go to. And so, just, not too many decades ago, just, half a century ago or so, this was the best view of Mars that we had. We had not yet sent any robots to Mars. On the left, this is a visible image. You can see the ice caps on the north and south poles of Mars. The right is infrared. You can see clouds. So at this point, we've realized that Mars is a planet with some planetary processes, but Mars was not a destination of travel. And maybe there was some science fiction speculations, but there were not real momentum for the kind of space exploration that we see so prominently today. And so what changed was the atomic bomb. This is a picture of the mushroom cloud from Hiroshima. And this is a very direct connection to what enabled space exploration, although the actual nuclear testing was not directly connected to space. It was the rocketry technology that was accelerated from the Cold War, the competition for missile dominance between primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as other countries, that drove the rocketry technology that we use today to enable human spaceflight and robotic spaceflight. And so I love showing this image. Just okay, on the left, we have an intercontinental ballistic missile made by Boeing. On the right, we have the Falcon 9 rocket made by the private company SpaceX. So, what's the difference between these two things? It's really what you put in the top. Do you have a nuclear warhead up at the top? Or do you have a capsule that has some sort of cargo, whether it's putting a satellite in orbit or delivering some other payload or perhaps sending humans somewhere? The fundamental technology of a rocket is the same. A rocket for war and a rocket for peace are not that fundamentally different. And so one of the themes that I like to think about when I talk about this connection is on the right here with SpaceX, we have democratized rocketry. We are still in what I call a new Cold War, where the technological nations on Earth are still competing for missile dominance. But instead of doing that by testing nuclear weapons in the air, which is strictly illegal to explode them in the air, that's been banned by treaties, and instead of, fighting massive scale wars to demonstrate, that you could do a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki again. Space exploration is a surrogate for demonstrating your missile sophistication. And so in some sense, this is good because this is the reality of the world we're in. There's over 10,000 nuclear warheads on Earth today, way too many. But the reality is we're kind of locked into a peace that's not collapsed into global nuclear warfare by the fact that everybody has these weapons. And so by using space as a way to demonstrate missile superiority in a peaceful way, that's the reality, and that's one of the benefits of space exploration. That's one of the reasons it gets unanimous support, in the U.S. In Congress, because this is really fulfilling a political goal as well as scientific goals. And so, I love this picture. This is the Perseverance rover taking a selfie of itself in a composite image on the surface of Mars. You see the Ingenuity helicopter in the back. That's the first drone to fly on another planet. Why are we doing this? Well, there's great science involved. I study Mars. I love the science results that come out of this. But when you fly a drone on another planet, this also sends a message, for example, in this case, from the United States to Russia and to China, saying, this is how sophisticated our rocketry technology is. We can land a rover on Mars and deliver a drone and have it fly around with precision. That could translate to wartime advantages. And so even in times of peace or just geopolitical tensions without actually launching missiles, these scientific feats are actually also demonstrations of political, military, technological superiority. And so I say all that just to say that space has already transformed us. And I think this is good, whether you like the connection or not. I think it's fundamentally good that we are sending rockets to Mars instead of launching rockets at each other. And so in that sense, it's a healthy replacement. But I think it's important to highlight that connection. And so from here, I just want to, go into a little bit of value theory just to talk about what we mean by transformation. So what is the value of a planet for space settlement? So I've already talked about the value of space exploration, but what's the purpose of Mars and sending humans there? What do we get out of this? And so just a brief, overview of some value theory. This is from philosophy, environmental ethics. Something has instrumental value if it has a means to an end. Your hammer has an instrumental value because you can use it to build things. Intrinsic value is something that is worthwhile in and of itself. And so most systems of ethics, nearly all systems of ethics, recognize humans as being intrinsically valuable. A human life has value regardless of any instrumental value that the human may also have. You might be a carpenter and you have instrumental value to build a house, but if you lose your ability to be a carpenter, you still have intrinsic value as a person, just by virtue of being a person. And so these ideas, you can attempt to apply these to other situations. And in this case, we're talking about planets like Mars, which don't have life. So it's really focused on does the planet itself have any value, instrumental value, in the sense that we might use the planet for something. So we'll decompose this just a little bit. Instrumental value, means to an end, you can think of one type of this as a demand value, something that satisfies a felt preference. I could be hungry, I get a Snickers bar, that satisfies my felt preference for hunger for something sweet. You can divide your demand value into use value, something that's realized today. I've got my Snickers bar right now, I'm eating it right now. Or option value, maybe I give some money to the Girl Scouts and they're going to deliver cookies to me in a few weeks. So now there's going to be this felt preference that is satisfied, but not today. It's going to be realized into the future. And maybe there's a reason that I would want to do that. And so you can think about with Mars, we don't have humans on Mars. We have some scientific value that we're getting from Mars. But when we talk about space settlement, people living long duration on Mars, option value is really where we are focused. And so you can imagine images like this, where Mars, the surface of Mars is covered by these interacting, interlaced modules that might be controlled by different countries, maybe living together peacefully, maybe fulfilling scientific goals, maybe growing plants in hydroponic indoor agriculture settings, maybe engaged in commercial activities, whatever that would be. But we're not doing this yet. This is, we may be investing in the technology today to provide option value for Mars so that it'll fulfill some of these preferences in the future. So non-demand value, to contrast with what I just talked about, it does something else other than satisfying a felt preference. So what could those things be? Well, that could just be what we call intrinsic value, the existence value. So, maybe just nature's projects are valuable in and of themselves. So Mars perhaps is valuable because it's the only planet like it in the solar system. And you could even say things like maybe certain asteroids have more existence value than others because certain asteroids are redundant and very similar to each other, but some are much more unique. We only have one planet like Jupiter, but maybe that we have a lot of comets that are pretty similar. And so you could use that way of thinking to decide how invasive or intrusive you might want to be with your scientific investigations or other actions. And so then the final type of value that I really want to talk about for the rest of this talk is transformative value. So transformative value is something that instead of satisfying a felt preference, it actually examines or alters my felt preference. So this is still instrumental. So, you could think about a classic example of this is, maybe you have a stockbroker whose whole world is about acquiring wealth and increasing their status in industry, and they're taken hiking by their friends and they see the sunrise on a mountaintop and they just have this epiphany and they leave the hike and realize that their life has not been aligned the way that they feel like it matters now, and then this person redirects their wealth and their time towards ecological conservation or raising awareness about some other social issue. And so in that sense, the seeing the sunrise from the mountain had transformative value. The hike and the park itself can have this kind of transformative value for this person, in that instead of satisfying their felt preference for acquisition of wealth, it transformed their preferences to something new. And so transformative experiences provide a way to catalyze permanent epistemic change, like in the example I just gave you, by examining the boundaries between the self and the environment. In that simple example, this person maybe had an epiphany about being connected to the broader community of nature on Earth. And so with space, we are literally challenging our planetary boundaries, taking ourselves away from our environment to try to live somewhere new. And so I think that space settlement, human expansion into other parts of space, is really going to give us um, new opportunities for permanent epistemic change. And so I like this quote from the book Transformative Experience. In transformative situations, we do not know enough about what our lived experience will be like afterwards. How do you know how this thing is going to change you? You don't. So what do? We should draw upon empirical findings when the right sorts of findings are available. And so just for the rest of, a couple minutes here, I'm going to go into just two examples that I was able to find. I will tell you, I don't talk about religious experiences, not because religious experiences don't transform people, but because they're not repeatable in any case. You could design a religious service that's profoundly moving to one person, and you put other people in there, and it's not moving, whether they belong to that religion or not, especially if they don't. And so although there's lots of experiences where people may personally have a transformative experience, I'm looking at what empirical findings are repeatable and can give us some insight into how space settlement might transform us. And so the first one is the overview effect. This is seeing the Earth from above. And so if you've flown in an airplane, you have had a version of the overview effect like this, which, especially if you're a kid, but also if you're an adult, this is, somewhat profound, at least in a small way. And it's definitely fun for the first time to see an overview of the places that you've lived, and you definitely get some new perspective on what it means to just live in your local area and live on the planet. And as you move out, you start to see the curvature of Earth, and some space tourists are finally getting this opportunity, expanding beyond just professional astronaut, to see Earth from space, even if you don't see the whole planet. Um, and astronaut Alseco Jr. has called this the astronaut's secret. When you see this perspective, you have a feeling that we are a member of the whole human family, a citizen of the universe. You ask yourself, why do people have the differences they have on Earth? You see Earth as a small part of a large universe, and you have these feelings that are hard to describe. Not all astronauts have this exact same experience, but many of them do. And so in that sense, it's an empirical finding that is more repeatable than some of the other transformative experiences we have on Earth. If you move beyond to further out in orbit, traveling to the moon, you can see the entire disk of Earth, which gives you a new perspective. And then, of course, this iconic image, Earth from lunar orbit. Astronauts described being able to just put out their thumb and cover the Earth, and that's just profound that you could actually just blot out Earth with your thumb at that distance. The overview effect was probably most popularized by astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who had what he called a peak experience or a religious experience, depending on what word you want to use. He called it an explosion of awareness, an aha, a wow, what you call a revelation. And he described the universe as being made up of spirit and matter, but they're not separate. The bridge is consciousness. God is something like a universal consciousness manifest in each individual. The route to divine reality and to a more satisfying human reality is through human consciousness. I mean, this sounds very mystical. And this was a trained astronaut that NASA sent into space. And so the fact that traveling into space and viewing Earth from a distance can evoke these kind of experiences, I think is worth keeping in mind, that when we go into space, and as humans go into space, especially tourists, and we increase the number of people, you're going to have personal and perhaps societal transformative experiences that go well beyond the stated intention of the mission or the tourist expedition. And so here is Earth from Mars. And I think when we finally see this image, this is obviously taken by a rover, but when a human stands in this point, this is going to evoke novel psychological transformative experiences that have not yet been articulated. I think this is going to be both profound and perhaps terrifying to stand here and see Earth at that distance. So the last example I'll talk about just briefly is psychedelia. This is, again, why am I talking about this? This is one of the few repeatable empirical findings that we have for how an experience can lead to transformations in a way that can be at least somewhat predictable in some cases. So just worth noting some historical developments here. Edgar Mitchell, moved by his experiences with the overview effect, founded the Institute for Noetic Sciences, which is still active today, is their website. And so they explore the bridge between outer space and the mysteries of inner space. Um, Obviously a big milestone was Albert Hofmann, who's a chemist working in industry. He synthesized LSD. He was working just on some medical applications, and he actually synthesized it in 1938, but didn't discover its psychoactive properties until 1943, which was actually by accident. But then shortly thereafter, it became commercialized by the Sandoz pharmaceutical company, and then later, obviously, manufactured underground. The CIA was interested in this, and they bought millions of doses of LSD from the Sandoz pharmaceutical company, largest single purchase. And Project MK Ultra conducted many experiments, many of which we don't know much more about other than the existence of them. But for a couple decades, there was even a manual called psychedelic or LSD, some unpsychedelic implications, all the copies of which have been destroyed. So we'll never know what was in that. But we do know that there was concern that maybe the Soviets would weaponize this, and then also even wild speculations as to, could we use this for some kind of psychic mind control? I mean, the CIA has different standards of inquiry than many of us do as scientists, and they were just interested in understanding if this is a possibility. We want to know about this because there's security implications. And then the idea of psychedelics really reached public consciousness in the West by an article in Life magazine in 1957. There was a banker, a wealthy banker, and his wife traveled to Mexico and met a medicine woman who gave them a mushroom ceremony, and then they wrote about it, and Life published a multi-page spread full with photos about this. And then this instigated many others to seek similar tourist experiences. And then perhaps most prominently, you have the psychedelic counterculture from the mid '60s into the '70s. At the bottom, here's Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard professor encouraging people to tune in, turn on, and drop out. The top on the left, you have further the psychedelic bus that the merry pranksters drove around in from the West Coast around the country, passing out LSD to people, and they would hang posters like this: "Can you pass the acid test?" Where there'd be parties with lights and the Grateful Dead playing and all kinds of just experimentation with what can be learned from this. And at this time, people were not sure what the boundaries of this were, but certainly there was a lot of reports of personal psychological transformations, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Um, there was a particular researcher, Alexander Shuglin, he was a chemist. He had a license from the FDA to hold controlled substances, and he would engage in tests with a private group as to what the potential outcomes could be with different psychedelic compounds. And so he evolved a method of assigning symbols to the perceived strength or intensity of the experiences, which he wrote about in a book. Some of his other research was published in journals. But I think just, in the short overview here, he had a +1, +2, +3, which just referred to the intensity of the experience. But then he has this +4 category it's a class by itself. It's not more than or comparable to a +3. He calls this a serene and magical state, independent of what drug is used. And some of his participants took no drug. They took a placebo and still had a +4 experience in some cases. He called it a peak experience, which draws back to what Edgar Mitchell had talked about. It can't be repeated at will, but it's that kind of mystical or religious experience which will never be forgotten and bring about a deep change of perspective or life direction of the person who's graced with it. And so I think this is what a lot of people between CIA experiments and the psychedelic counterculture, at least some people had these kind of experiences that were profoundly moving, could not be repeated, but still left long-lasting transformation. So are there any psychedelic experiences that are common or repeatable? Well, I did find one. So Rick Strassman has he was a medical doctor. He was funded by government funds for a little while. And he found that the use of DMT can induce a repeated contact kind of scenario that was consistent among different volunteers. And he said theirs were not the first to note this. There was experiments in the 50s that found a striking similarity between people who take DMT and meet up with with other beings in what they call a non-material world. That's at least what people are reporting they're experiencing. And so in these case reports, the volunteers have strikingly similar experiences and similar to naturally occurring psychedelic states of consciousness. There's overlap in how they describe their experiences of high-dose DMT sessions and a similarity with people who've undergone spontaneous near-death, spiritual, and mystical states. So the similarities between naturally occurring and DMT-induced phenomena support his suggestion that spontaneously occurring psychedelic experiments are mediated by levels of endogenous DMT. I mean, this even makes me think of people who report being abducted by aliens, and in many cases, some of the reports of volunteers who were clinically given high doses of DMT were very similar to people who reported being abducted by aliens. And so I think this opens up many more questions than it resolves, but the idea that there could be similarities in psychological experiences when people undergo intense, stressful, mystical experiences, as well as ingesting a psychedelic compound. I think this is interesting, and I think this does give us some direction for how to think about space settlement. And so when I go back here, just to kind of close, I'm going to make a prediction. I think that when humans stand here in this picture, when you stand on Mars and we're looking at Earth, I think there's going to be awe and wonder. I think there's going to be terror and fear just looking at the distance, realizing how hard it is to get back. But I think people are going to report contact with extraterrestrials, but they're not going to be the kind of extraterrestrials that astrobiologists are looking for. I think they're going to be the kind of beings that people who take high doses of DMT report meeting, the kind of beings that people who are undergoing meditative mystical state or have near-death experiences meet. And I think this is going to be a psychologically induced meeting in a sense with what is reported as extraterrestrials. And I think we have to be ready, whether I'm exactly right with that or it's different in some ways. I think we have to be ready for how the human mind is going to react to being this far off our planet in a new environment and confronted with different physical and sensory stresses that we're not used to. And so I do talk about more of this in my book, Sovereign Mars, if you are interested. But just to kind of summarize, Mars settlement offers us a unique opportunity for personal and civilizational transformation, but we cannot predict how it's going to transform us. So we should keep thinking about, overview effect, psychedelia, maybe other empirical examples for how we can understand these transformative experiences. So that is what I have.
Oh, that's fantastic, Jacob. We did have a question from Sanjoy about the possible negative impacts of transformative experiences, and you mentioned that briefly at the end. But this idea that maybe seeing the Earth from space makes people feel small and insignificant, and might even make them feel worthless, or other connotations of negative feelings and impacts from those transformative experiences. How do you think we can help people gauge experiences in a way that helps bring more value to them?
No, this is a great question. Our transformative experiences can certainly be negative. So Lorianne Paul, who wrote her book on transformative experiences, the main example she uses is, do you decide to have a child or not? If you're an adult and you're trying to decide, do we want to have a baby or not? You don't know what that experience is going to be like on the other side. You can't go back. Once you've had that, you can do things like ask other parents for advice, ask friends and family, but you don't ever really get a full picture of knowing what that's going to be like. And now many people who have children report immense joy and say this is the best decision they've ever made. Not everybody does. And you don't know if you're going to be one of those people or not. And so the same thing could be for going into space. You may come back away with a transformed perspective that you wish you didn't have. The same thing could be said for ever having a religious experience or taking a psychedelic or any of these examples, even going on a hike and seeing the sunset, and then now you realize some things about yourself, but you wish you hadn't. So I don't have an easy answer for how you can make them all the way positive, consistently positive, other than I think to keep drawing on these empirical examples to better understand that. For the decision to have a child, maybe there's more empirical findings, but you'll never really know. So it is a good question.
Yeah, and a fun realm of sci-fi that brings that into people's minds might be Cypher from the film The Matrix. He doesn't want to live a life of being exposed to reality that's cold and harsh and brutal and uncomfortable, and he wakes up in a cold metal spaceship thing and feels like he has to eat gruel every day. He wants to be plugged into the fake world because it feels better. Um, and that film speaks a lot to transformation in lots of ways. There are a couple of more questions here. Before I show my own slides and talk through some things, we can just address those. From Jack Madden, I'm worried that the dependence of current space ventures in the military-industrial complex will cement war into the foundation of our cosmic purpose. Some of us would argue it already is. Would you rather space travel be sustainably independent of military contractors, even if it takes longer to establish an entirely peaceful space industry? Maybe if we need war to become spacefaring, we aren't ready to go as a species.
No, I mean, it's a great question. That's why I started the presentation by talking about the connection with space to, the new Cold War. And I mean, I don't take the position that we should be living on Mars anytime soon. I think we should be talking about it now. And for two reasons. One is if we do go, then the sooner we start talking about it, the better our outcome is going to be. And if we don't go, at least ever or in the near term future, we're going to improve the condition on Earth by taking our ideas from Earth, putting them on Mars as a thought experiment, seeing like how would you make civilization work on Mars? The Mars environment is so harsh that you're going to stretch your mind thinking about sustainability. Like air is a commodity on Mars. You can't go very long without air. You have to manufacture it. So it stretches our limits to thinking about what we have to do to live on Mars, and that will give us, some insight on Earth. So yeah, I think, like it or not, all space ventures are connected to, the military complex in some ways. I think that it's not realistic to scrap it all and start over. I think that that's just not really, um, it maybe makes for good science fiction, but I think this is the reality we're in. So I think the best case scenario is what I call democratizing rocketry. I think the fact that we are taking rockets out of the hands of the military exclusively. We have private companies developing their own rocketry, and they have no way of getting their hands on nuclear technology. It's controlled by the Department of Energy in the United States. Nuclear proliferation is an important problem, but private companies are not developing nuclear weapons. So I think that's the best case scenario, like it or not. I think that's how space commercialization and settlement is going to develop. And so at least decoupling it from the military is I would say a step in the right direction.
Yeah, agreed. We have another question from Roma Martinez, but I think I'll save that one because I can address it during the slides I'll present here. And I'll go fairly quick through mine so we have some time for more conversation from everyone. Just so everyone knows, if you do want to chat with everyone else in the chat as well, there should be a little blue box that down at the very bottom of the chat window. You can click on that and it'll let you chat to everyone as well. But please be respectful. Let me do the quick share screen thing as well. And I'm gonna optimize for sound if we get there. Okay, and then I should see the participants list and I have the chat open as well. Cool. All right, so I will run through what I have fairly quickly. I'll admit, I just got back from a family vacation, and so I did not work on my slides as much as I thought I would, and so mine are kind of a mix of some other ideas, but it's interesting how much overlap there's going to be in the things that I have to share, and what Jacob shared. Certainly our future out there is something we've dreamt of and wondered about for quite some time in human history. The earliest sci-fi story might be Lucian's, a true story from the 2nd century. So, 1800 years is a long time to think about how space might impact our lives. It was, a fictional story, But as early as the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were wondering about how rocketry and exploring space would truly transform us. This might be an apocryphal quote. I've never found the actual attribution of this quote. It looks like it's from a book from the 1950s, but it's claimed to be from Tsiolkovsky in the late 1800s. But from the moment of using rocket devices, a great new era will begin in astronomy, the epoch of the more intensive study of the firmament, a better understanding of our Earth from space. Those who are tuning in, and I know many of you, you might know my favorite short story of all is Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon. He wrote this in 1937. It's a vision of a human consciousness leaving its body, having a very almost psychedelic experience by traveling out into the cosmos, interacting with alien beings, and having various scaled conscious experiences of the universe. But in the very beginning of this book, the main character, the narrator, is leaving the Earth and looking back. And in 1937, Stapleton envisioned seeing the Earth from space 9 years before the very first photo from space. He saw that the sheer beauty of our planet surprised me. It was a huge pearl set in spangled ebony. And what I love about that passage even more is he goes on to say, I seem to feel as never before the vital presence of Earth as of a vital creature alive, but tranced and obscurely yearning to wake. This vision of our Earth as a living being has been around since before we began sending rockets into space and seeing our world from the outside. And of course, now obviously we've had those experiences. We've seen the Earth from beyond. We have things like the pale blue dot and the blue marble and the Earthrise image. Jacob spoke of the overview effect. And I'm friends with Frank White, and I absolutely love the ideas that he shared in his book on the overview effect. It's really inspired me in how I think about our world. But as I've often argued to Frank, I don't think we as individuals need to go to space necessarily to have the overview effect happen. So much as Jacob mentioned this idea of peak experiences, I've been a longtime practitioner of meditation. I've had those wonderful peak experiences, those singular moments. And when I was very young, and I would try to chase these moments down, like try to like find the high of being there again. But I realized fairly early on you couldn't chase it. It was a unique, singular experience that you had as an individual. But when you start sharing it with others, that's when it becomes a more transformative experience, in my opinion. Because you have the transformative self happen, but then you also have this larger societal transformation happen. And seeing our Earth from space has very much done that for many of us. I imagine everyone in this call, and everyone who's watching this video later has had some impact in their lives of seeing these images from space. For me personally, I have a huge repository of screenshots from science fiction, film, and television, of various visions of seeing the Earth from the outside. Just real quickly, these are Critters 4, Star Trek The Motion Picture. We have Alien Resurrection, Predator, Independence Day, Flash Gordon, and there are so many more. It is now transcended this idea of seeing our Earth from the outside, traveling to other worlds, and considering what our human future in space beyond the Earth might be like. And to that, I shared this image. I forget now where I found this. I think I found this image somewhere online some many years ago. And I shared it on social media. I don't even know who created it. I didn't create this, but I shared it and I wrote about climate change and our future destruction of ourselves and how it might be the end. And someone reminded me that this phrase, here we are, at least for now, could also be something more positive to think of where our future is going. That here we are, at least for now, might mean here we are until we travel out there and become that next iteration of the human civilization. I'm reading right now Jerry O'Neill's book, The High Frontier, this idea of space, of colonies in space, which, now we use the word space settlement more often. Um, it's been around since the 1970s, visualizing a near space environment of habitats and space stations. Of course, we have a lot of other people now who brought in ideas both in science and science fiction of what inhabiting other worlds might look like. We had the Havoc, this high altitude Venus operational concept design of maybe we'll have spaceships or even some kind of infrastructure in the atmosphere of Venus in the not too distant future. Of course, many people in this call are aware that we are very actively thinking of the future that we might have on Mars, and there's this beautiful artist rendering of what one possible vision of a future on Mars might look like. Many of us here, I imagine, are also have been analog astronauts. Perhaps you've done work at the Mars Desert Research Station, like I have, or other habitats like D Mars, High Seas. There's now so many. There's actually an analog astronaut conference that meets in May of this year with a lot of folks who've done analog astronautics, dreaming of what our future on these other worlds might be like. And I thought it'd be kind of fun. If you haven't seen this video before, I'm going to show it. Made some years ago by Eric Vernquist. It's called Wonders. It's only 3 minutes long, so I promise it'll go fairly quickly. But please let me know in the chat if you can't hear the audio here.
For all its material advantages, the sedentary life has left us edgy, unfulfilled. Even after 400 generations in villages and cities, we haven't forgotten. The open road still softly calls, like a nearly forgotten song of childhood. We invest far-off places with a certain romance. The appeal, I suspect, has been meticulously crafted by natural selection as an essential element in our survival. Long summers, mild winters, rich harvests, plentiful game. None of them lasts forever. Your own life, or your band's, or even your species might be owed to a restless few drawn by a craving they can hardly articulate or understand, to undiscovered lands and new worlds. Herman Melville in Moby Dick spoke for wanderers in all epochs and meridians. He said, "I am tormented with an everlasting itch for things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas." Maybe it's a little early. Maybe the time is not quite yet. But those other worlds, promising untold opportunities, beckon. Silently, they orbit the sun, waiting.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film. And Amy, yes, you're right. That was the words of Carl Sagan in the film from Cosmos. Also based a lot on The Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan. But also included ideas of like large rotating cylinder space stations from the high frontier. You might have noticed there was flying on Titan and its thick atmosphere. There was base jumping off the cliffs of Vera Rupes there. A lot of future of Mars exploration, of building space settlements into asteroidal materials in our solar system. And it's so profound to think of some of the words that Sagan shared for this vision of what our human future in space might be. As he wrote in Cosmos, exploration is in our nature. We began as wanderers, and we are wanderers still. We have lingered long enough on the shores of the cosmic ocean. We are ready at last to set sail for the stars. And I've always been moved by that. I imagine you have somehow as well, in your own lives, having transformative experiences through such powerful language. But I do have to wonder, is it going to be us who's setting sail for those stars? I'm sure many of you have heard of the famed Drake equation that we use in astrobiology. It's been around since 1960. It was originally proposed as an idea that could bring together our knowledge currently and what we don't know if we need to discover how many communicating civilizations might be in our galaxy right now with whom we could communicate. I'm not going to go through the whole equation right now, just pointing out that one of my favorite parts of the Drake equation is the very last factor, the L factor. The average lifetime or the average time span for any of these communicating civilizations that might be out there. 1960 was a poignant time to think about possible lifespans of civilizations. Jacob already mentioned this possibility for nuclear warfare that we've had on top of us. For all of us here, I imagine, ever since we were born, I can't remember a time of not thinking about it being possible. I'm watching the documentary on Netflix right now, Turning Point, the bomb in the Cold War that came out last year, and it's even more of a reminder of how close we continue to be all the time at absolute destruction of ourselves. And we still have tens of thousands of these just globally destructive warheads around the planet. Um, but that's not the only possible issue with the L factor. The L factor might not be just destroying yourself, it might be altering yourself. Right now, a lot of us are wondering where AI is going. Is AGI in the future? Are brain-computer interfaces or BCIs going to happen soon? Neuralink is moving exceptionally quickly. Whenever I read the news of recent science events, I keep reading of more events where, someone who has been paralyzed has now given some stimulation through a very fundamental kind of basic BCI approach. It's going to change a lot about us. We might start doing more gene editing experiments. Maybe even the act of space settlement itself will drive us into doing more gene editing and BCI experimentation to see if we can augment the human to better survive other space habitats. But also, there is the question when it comes to how fast we are moving right now with AI without having any real control and any real major ethical discussions around the world globally as to what happens with AGI. What happens if AGI is used for warfare and we see something like Skynet in the Terminator films where it just drives us into utter obliteration as a species to then take over? And there's also the potential that maybe not just transforming ourselves, maybe we will meet alien life soon. I just finished Andy Weir's book, Project Hail Mary. Great read. It was a lot of fun. I cried at the end. And I love the film Arrival, and I love all these sci-fi stories that consider what contact with an alien life form might be like. In many of these stories, though, we consider that the alien life is very, very similar to our own, that we would somehow easily understand its language and culture. Even in Arrival, which is based on Ted Chiang's short story, Stories of Your Life, it's this idea of a communicating civilization that has a different perception of time, but even then, they still end up communicating in a way that's fairly decipherable by humans. Um, and maybe it's because of how we go looking for alien life that we see things this way. Stanislav Lem Solaris said, "We are searching for an ideal image of our own world." And so maybe when we try to imagine what alien life might be like, maybe we are radically underprepared for meeting those aliens, the same way that some of us would argue are radically underprepared for AGI right now. A lot of things might change drastically. I am going to just quickly jump to one more idea since I have a little bit of time and I do want to have some time for questions from everyone involved here. So Jacob mentioned the overview effect and psychedelic experiences. I've mentioned meditation. Recently, I proposed this idea of the panzoic effect, that the sheer act of thinking about alien life and alien worlds and what's possible out there and how similar or radically different it might be, that this itself can also be one of those transformative experiences. It might open up a view for some of us to a way of seeing ourselves in the cosmos. And much like I mentioned earlier, there's some negative connotations here as well. I've talked to some people who feel when they think about alien life, they feel insignificant, they feel scared, they feel uncertain of why we're even doing the things we're doing. It can bring existential dread, but it can bring so much existential hope to think of what our future might be should we go out there. And in some ways, I'd even argue that some of the fears of possible advanced alien life, if anything, should make us feel even more driven to unite as a species in the biosphere and to go out and begin space settlement for the sheer fact that we might need to be prepared for a less than perfect first contact scenario. I think for time's sake, I'm going to stop my share there. And then we can just have an open conversation. I know some more questions had come in through the chat. My camera's getting a little funky all of a sudden. Let me turn that off for one moment.
Oh, thanks so much, Graham. That was fascinating.
Should be
I
better.
just finished reading Greg Agigan's book about the global history of the UFO phenomenon, and he had a great quote that extraterrestrials are here. They are in our minds. We are thinking about them, and whether or not we have made physical contact with them yet, the reality of us contemplating extraterrestrial life is very much part of our world now, and that's not going away.
Absolutely.
So I guess there was a question, it was asked earlier by Roma that I think you wanted to tackle.
Yeah, so I forgot to address that when I was talking about these analog habitats, which could be a great place for us in a controlled environment to possibly study psychedelic experiences in a place where humans are isolated. There are other places where humans go into isolation studies and things like that as well. But I can say for myself, I think one important thing in meditation, in psychedelia, and a lot of these experiences is how we frame it. And there's really good arguments for why you should have a guide or someone with experience in these realms to help you understand what you're experiencing. And so I think, people going into isolation and, these long-term space settlement situations, if they are going to use something like psychedelics or meditation to improve the experience for themselves, it would be helpful to have a framework to help guide those people, I think. Just like I think for the panzoic effect, the folks I've talked to who have more negative feelings about it, it tends to be because they haven't had anyone really walk through the possible optimistic and beneficial experiences with them. Not to say that I'm undervaluing their experience by any means, but it can be helpful. Recently, I wrote a post in my own newsletter about the concept of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. For those who've read The Wind in the Willows, it's this experience that these two characters in this story have where they meet basically a deity of nature, the god Pan, some people argue. And in the experience is so arousing for them and so powerful for them that they can't place it in their lives. There's no way to frame it. And so in the story, the deity fortunately gives them the benefit of amnesia, so they forget the depth of the full experience and just know that it was something of value for them, which makes it more livable for them. There are other places in meditation and psychedelia where people have had these big like window opening experiences where they've seen something greater or felt something greater, but then it was easier for them if they could speak to someone to help them frame what that experience was. And so I think for isolation, for future space settlement, if we're going to use various realms like that, it would be helpful to have some kind of framing structure for everyone who does those things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's a great answer. Corey asked a question that I'd like to comment on here. He says, would you believe that space is something that all countries should work together in exploring and unraveling rather than just trying to one up each other, or is competition a good thing? And I think that's a great question. And so on the surface of it, I mean, I'm totally in favor of cooperation. I think there's great examples. The International Space Station has modules that are managed by different countries. There's many space projects led by NASA, ESA, other space agencies, where many countries, even small countries, contribute components to the spacecraft and share the data with their scientists. And I think that should continue, and I think that's great. The one thing that I think is just the reality is the countries that have launch capabilities are all nuclear powers. And this is again, comes back to the new Cold War that we're in. This is one reason that you have countries like North Korea and Pakistan trying to develop nuclear weapons, because they are trying to be politically relevant and increase their recognition as global powers. But aside from those two, most of the other countries who have nuclear weapons also are launching rockets into space. And so, whatever collaboration you might have, you have to collaborate, right, at least for now, with the countries that have those launch capabilities. And then, the other thing I'll say is even if it becomes more of a friendly competition and launch capabilities become more widespread, the example of India, for example, sending an orbiter to Mars, was a swelling of national pride. There was some criticism that, like, India has a lot of widespread poverty, low access to sanitation in some parts of the country. Why are you going to space? But there was a swelling of national pride. There was a swelling of the country's technical capacities, and just a demonstration of the sophistication, even in the wake, in the face of the poverty. India is still a technologically capable country that can launch a rocket into space and put it in an orbit around Mars and gain some useful data from that. So I think there's, the reality is whoever has the rockets is going to have some sort of advantage, and there's going to be a competition for everybody to get those. But that doesn't mean that it has to be the kind of competition that is not a friendly competition. I would love to see China and the other Western powers working more closely together rather than locked into the kind of competition we see now.
Yeah, agreed. We have a question. I apologize. I don't quite know how to pronounce your name. It's Kagan or Khan Walker, perhaps. As a species that is beginning to direct our own evolution, how do you think the human mind will need to evolve to become a sustainable spacefaring species? And what do you think these changes will look like? Hmm. That's a fun one. So
That's a
I
great
would I would
question.
I would argue that, so I mean, not only do we not really know what life is yet, we don't really know what intelligence is, and we don't really know what consciousness is quite yet. And I think in this realm, as we continue, developing, BCIs, and we continue this drive towards AI for everything, and possible AI or AGI in the very near future, those things, those tools will also be used to help us radically change ourselves. We're going to change how our minds function, how our intelligence functions. I'm reading both Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow right now, and I have to say, reading those two books at the same time really makes me think a lot about what the future might be for the human mind and how we think about things in various ways, but how our intuition shows us what to think and how radically it might be for AGI when it comes about. And for going out into space and exploring, there are some of us who've argued that we may very well likely and perhaps should alter the human species entirely to survive better on Mars, to survive better in other habitats and other environments. The human body, we evolved as we are now to live on this planet, and things are very different out there. And so there might be a lot of reason for us to change. What those changes might look like, I think we would be radically wrong in whatever we say it's going to look like, because I think it's going to be so different than what we've dreamt of in sci-fi that we're going to have to see what we see when we get there.
The way that I would answer that question actually ties into Jack's question too next, where he says, artists have played a big role, fiction writers envisioning the future, some more scientifically honest than others. So what role do artists play? And I think, for me, there are some examples of science fiction that are trying to do the hard sci-fi thing and maybe make predictions or projections. To me, I think those are actually less useful. And I think dwelling on sci-fi as a way to envision our technical future is the wrong way, in my opinion, to approach sci-fi. I think science fiction and art in general is about the human experience. And I think the best science fiction is about human, it's things go wrong in the best science fiction, things that you would never have happen in a NASA mission, for example, but that what makes for a tragedy in a taxpayer funded mission makes for a really great story and tells us more something about ourselves. So I think, how do are our minds going to develop? I don't know how, but I think that is a very important role for artists and fiction writers, is helping us explore that human dimension and the psychological dimension. And I think those stories and that art will be a better way to prepare us for that reality.
Yeah, I agree on that too. I love science fiction. I love these stories, but I think you're right. Like they're human stories. Even when we create aliens in science fiction, we use them to tell very human stories. The non-human characters in Star Trek, for instance, often have some of the best human stories. With the character of Data, for instance, in Star Trek: Next Generation, they explore issues of sentience and the rights that robotic humanoids might have in our very near future now. Other characters explore dimensions of what happens if you lose part of your humanity and become a different thing for some time and come back, or what happens in Star Trek Voyager to the Doctor, what happens if you're built as a hologram or built as an AI VR character, like an avatar, and then you gain sentience. What rights do you have? Is a huge question for us to consider.
All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour, but I guess Sybil has a comment, so we could probably tackle her question here. So discussions have been vital to science. Semi-documentary storytelling, a type of settlement with lots of isolation. Mentioned the story of McMurdo. So these practical thought experiments can develop and contextualize our work. How do we continue to support these? I mean, I think that is great. So, one of the directions I've kind of taken my work in thinking about space governance since writing my book, Sovereign Mars, is just what other historical analogs do we have on Earth that could apply to space settlement? And I've worked with some great students in the Blue Marble Space Young Scientist program and in our Visiting Scholar program in thinking about some of the examples. So we have like McMurdo, the Antarctic Treaty System. We have the Law of the Seas. One project we've looked on is just referendums on Earth, like in Catalonia or in Quebec, or in other examples. How do our experiences for voter referendums on Earth inform what could or could not be possible on Mars, or are thinking about technical standards like the International Telecommunications Union or the Universal Postal Union. We even have one project looking at the Pennamite-Yankee War, when the U.S. was first being settled and you had territory disputes. What can we learn from these examples? And so I think there is value in examining our own political and social history on Earth, and sort of placing them on Mars as thought experiments and seeing, what works, and perhaps more useful what doesn't work. And those negative examples might even be more informative in helping us think about what's possible as we venture out into space.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Graham. I very much enjoyed our conversation here. So, obviously stay in touch with us. We will have these webinars as a recurring series. We will continue inviting all of you to participate. But until then, thanks for joining us. We hope you had fun, and we will keep thinking about our future in space.
Thanks all.